Hello, class. Welcome to BMN 510 Church History, Week 4. Today we'll have our lecture and then we'll go over the study guide for next week's midterm exam. So let's go ahead and get started with the lecture. Again, this is BMN 510 Church History, Lecture 4. I'll be taking the lecture today also from the Church History in Plain Language by Bruce Shelley. It's a different book from the main textbook. Sometimes I like the way that this book presents the material a little better. So we'll go with this book today, and we'll cover verse chapter 17, Bending the Necks of Victors, Mission to the Barbarians. So this is mission to spreading the Christian message to those barbarian tribes that invaded and ultimately overthrew the Roman Empire in the West. That's what this is about. All right, so the forests of northern Europe were inhabited by barbarian tribes who sacrificed animals and worshipped nature spirits among the trees and beside the streams. Any missionary who ventured among them and hoped to convert them had to demonstrate the superior spiritual power of Christianity. The most famous incident tells of one 8th century missionary named Boniface who marched into a shrine in Germany, the sacred forest of Thor, the Germanic god of thunder, who you may know from the Marvel movies if you've seen those, that are based on these old Germanic and Norse myths and legends. So Boniface took an axe to a massive oak, which was seen as a sacred tree. Just as he took the first stroke, a mighty wind from God toppled the tree. The pagans marveled and were converted to Christianity. Boniface used the wood to build a chapel. Incidents such as this made Europe Christian. The missionary monks overthrew barbarian magic by calling on superior powers. With a few miracles and victorious battles, the Germans were ready for Christian baptism. So they were ready to change from their old gods to the Christian God. Christianity faced a new and enormous challenge when the German tribes swept across the Rhine and Danube frontier and left the once mighty empire of the Romans in disarray. The civilization that arose on those ruins was Christian in character because the invaders surrendered their gods. Why did the Germans come to worship the god of their defeated foes? Let's look first at the coming of the barbarians. The year 476 is usually given to mark the end of the Christian Roman Empire in the West. That is the year the long line of emperors inaugurated by Augustus ended and the undisguised rule by German leaders began. The event itself was not spectacular since the mercenary soldiers wielding the real power in the name of the emperor were mainly Germans who fought against the German barbarians. So Germans against Germans at that time. In 475, Orestes, the barbarian commander of the imperial troops, forced the Senate to elect his young son, Romulus Augustulus, as emperor in the West. The following year, however, another Germanic commander named Odovacer slew Orestes and deposed Romulus Augustulus, proclaiming himself head of the government. No one was particularly shocked, as they had been a generation earlier with the invasions of the barbarian forces led by Alaric, Gaiseric, and Attila. The Romans had called the Germanic tribes barbarians because during early contact with the Romans, they spoke no Greek or Latin. For the most part, they were tribes from the north, originally in or near Scandinavia. Vandals, Franks, Angles, Saxons, Goths, Lombards, Burgundians, and others. When they started to cause problems for the Romans in the 3rd century, they were at a cultural stage midway between a pastoral and an agricultural economy. Cattle, rather than money, marked the wealthy among them. The Germans were notorious for drinking and gambling, though their courage, respect for women, and freedom from many Roman vices were praised. A favorite amusement was listening to the tribal bards recite ancient tales of heroes and gods. The Germans lived to fight. Every warlord had a company of warriors linked to their leader by a personal oath of loyalty. During the centuries that the Romans and Germans faced each other across the Rhine Danube frontier, they had countless contacts with each other, peaceful as well as hostile. Roman trade reached into Germany, and Germans entered the empire as slaves. During the 3rd century, many barbarians were invited to settle on vacated lands within the empire or serve in the Roman legions. By the end of the 4th century, the Roman army in the West had become almost completely German. The crisis of mass invasions came with the sudden appearance of a new, uncontrollable force, the Huns. Late in the 4th century, this force subjugated the easternmost Germanic tribe, the Ostrogoths, and the terrified Visigoth tribe petitioned the Romans to allow them to settle as allies inside the empire. Rome granted this request, but mistreatment of the Visigoth tribe later led them to go on a rampage, defeating the Roman army in the Battle of Adrianople, a decisive battle which destroyed the legend of the invincible Roman legions and led to a century and a half of chaos. For a few years, the Emperor Theodosius I held back the Visigoths, but after his death in 395, they began to migrate and raid under their leader Alaric. He invaded Italy and his followers sacked Rome. To counter Alaric's threat to Italy, the Romans had withdrawn most of their troops from the Rhine frontier in 406 and from Britain the following year. The consequence of this action was a flood of Germanic tribes across the defenseless frontiers. The Vandals pushed their way through Gaul to Spain before moving to Africa. In 455, Vandal raiding force sacked Rome a second time. Meanwhile, the Burgundians settled in the Rhone Valley. The Franks gradually spread across northern Gaul, and the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes invaded Britain. Each of these tribes set up a German-ruled kingdom within the confines of the empire, though only those of the Franks in Gaul and the Angles and Saxons in Britain lasted longer than a few centuries. Today, we see that the Germanic invasions were not as catastrophic as was once thought, as most of the land seized by the invaders was either vacant or belonged to the emperors. Few private landowners were displaced. A gradual blending of the cultures and blood of the two peoples began. In time, the barbarians lost their Germanic custom, religion, and speech. So now we will look at missions to the north. The task of converting these northern peoples was enormous, since they wanted to enter into the grandeur of Rome. They accepted a nominal adherence to Christianity, so they at least called themselves Christians, which they saw as the Roman religion. So they called themselves Christians regardless of whether or not they believed Christian beliefs or practiced the teachings. But it was much more difficult to educate them, to teach them sufficiently the Christian faith and instill in them Christian behavior. The barbarians were brought to Orthodox Christianity in two ways: directly from paganism and indirectly through Arianism. We talked about that before, as the heresy that denied that Jesus Christ was the eternal Son of God. Arian teaching spread among them, among the barbarians, from the 4th century, the time when Arianism was strong in the empire. This Arianism, however, was more a matter of structure for them, as it did not have the ecclesiastical center of Rome. The German tribes were not as interested in the details of abstract theology. The Arian influence apparently began with missionary work among the Visigoths. A half century after the Council of Nicaea, a missionary named Ulfilas or Wulfila crossed the Danube to work among them for 40 years, leading them to faith in Christ, as Arius preached him, meaning leading them to the Arian understanding of who Christ is. So from the Goths, Arian Christianity spread to other Germanic tribes. Some of the earliest northern peoples to come to Christ were beyond the borders of the empire and were not themselves German. The Irish were a Celtic people, and their conversion is traced to Patrick early in the 5th century. Patrick had been taken captive during Irish raids in England. He later escaped, but a dream led him to return to Ireland to teach the Irish people about Christ. Patrick became a missionary to the people who had earlier enslaved him. A century later, the structure of the church in Ireland was predominantly monastic, as the monastic community that maintained itself on the land fit the agricultural communities of the Celts better than the parish church system common in the Roman Empire. Ireland then became the base for the evangelization of Britain, just as the Irish were known for journeying from Ireland. The missionary monks traveled to spread the Christian faith. An Irish monk named Columba led in the founding of a monastery on Iona, an island off the coast of Scotland, which led to the preaching of Christ in Britain. Celtic monks from Ireland and Britain also became missionaries to the European continent. They established monasteries in Germany, Switzerland, and even northern Italy. These monasteries became centers of evangelization and learning. Now we turn to the gospel among the Franks. Roman Catholic influence began in the northern half of Gaul among the Franks, the tribe destined for greatness in shaping Christian Europe. The founder of the nation was Clovis, who lived from 481 to 511, who was the first barbarian chief of importance to convert to Orthodox Christianity, as opposed to the Arian heresy. He was married to a Burgundian princess who was a Christian. His first son died after being baptized, and his second son fell sick after baptism, but recovered when the mother prayed. Then, in a battle, Clovis called upon Jesus at the point of nearly being defeated, and the king of the enemy tribe fled. He then persuaded his people to renounce their German gods. He and 3,000 of his people accepted Christian baptism. The first of many mass conversions during the Middle Ages raises important questions about the paganizing of Christianity. So in addition to Christianity spreading among pagans, pagan ideas also infiltrated and influenced Christianity. Missions can proceed in two ways. The first is through individual conversion with a period of instruction before baptism, which tends to uproot people from their own culture. The second is through mass conversion, the method that converted Europe. Kings like Clovis embraced the faith, and their people followed them into Christianity, which did not uproot individuals from their culture, but also meant the converts brought their superstitions and behavior into the church. So they were not, we would say, not fully converted before they accepted Christianity. So this is evident in many cases, starting with Clovis himself, who saw Jesus as a tribal war god and admired militant religion and saints who were military figures. The saints may well have meant more to the people than Christ himself, and they saw various saints as performing specific assignments, such as taking care of pigs or curing toothaches. The Germans could find a saint for almost every human need. Many tales circulated about the miraculous powers of the saints. The story is told of two beggars, one lame and the other blind, who were fearful of being cured when caught in a procession carrying the relics of a saint, since they did not want to be deprived of their livelihood of begging alms. They hurried to get away from the saint's miraculous powers, but failed, and they were cured. We'll turn now to passage to England. In spite of the shallow impact of the gospel among the Franks, their conversion did provide a passage through Gaul to Great Britain. The initiative for the conversion of the English came from Rome, as Pope Gregory the Great in 596 sent a party of Benedictine monks to the distant and barbaric land of England under the leadership of St. Augustine of Canterbury. So that's a different St. Augustine than the one we talked about. The more famous one is St. Augustine of Hippo, but this is St. Augustine of Canterbury. Augustine and his monks began their ministry in Kent, one of the areas controlled by the Anglo-Saxons, who had invaded and conquered much of England. Augustine met with King Ethelbert, who granted land for the foundation of a monastery at Canterbury, which ever since has been the headquarters of the English religious leader. Gregory appointed Augustine the first Archbishop of Canterbury. The missionaries who followed Augustine worked farther north. By the time of King Oswy in the late 7th century, the two missionary movements, Celtic followers of Columba working toward the south and followers of Augustine working toward the north, connected. However, Oswy followed the northern Celtic form of Christianity, while his wife followed the Roman practices, leading to disputes about matters such as the date of Easter. At the Synod of Whitby in 664, Oswy brought the matter to a decision. The Celtic advocate appealed to the authority of Columba, while the Romans appealed to that of Peter. Peter was, as we know, one of the major apostles. So the Romans argued that Christ had given Peter the keys of heaven, and therefore the papacy, or the office of pope, essentially descended from the apostle Peter. Impressed by such an important figure as the doorkeeper of heaven, Oswy agreed to follow the Roman practices, and the British Isles moved under the authority of the Roman Church. After being rooted in Anglo-Saxon England, Christianity returned to the continent with fresh vigor, with British missionaries such as Winfrid or Boniface, who was commissioned by Pope Gregory II in 729 to evangelize Germany. He had great success in his primary task of converting the pagan population, while also bringing the British and Irish missionary monks into closer relationship with the Bishop of Rome. Boniface was deeply devoted to the cause. Not only could he chop down a sacred tree while the multitude watched, expecting him to be struck dead because of the power of Thor or the other Germanic gods, but he did that without being struck dead. But he could also win the masses to the Christian faith and organize the districts in his authority to form a church structure bound to the central authority of Rome. Boniface became Archbishop of Mainz, yet he desired to return to his earlier efforts in the still pagan Frisia, which is the Netherlands, where he met the fate of martyrdom, or he was killed for his faith. All right, now we turn to chapter 19, God's Consul, Gregory the Great. Early in 590, Rome, after having faced the tragedies of floods and hardships of war, was struck with the spread of the plague. Men, women, and children died quickly with black eruptions after initially only experiencing a sore throat. Carts were piled high with corpses. People went insane, and even the Pope died in agony. For 6 months, no Pope ruled. When church leaders decided to elect a monk named Gregory as Pope, he refused the office and fled from the city until he was found and brought back to Rome, where he was consecrated as the new Pope. Gregory was a most unlikely candidate for greatness. He was older, frail, and had no desire for the papal office. Yet he began his administration with a public act of humiliation because the plague had taken the life of his predecessor. Processions filed through the streets for days, saying prayers and singing hymns. The plague initially continued to ravage the city, but it finally subsided. A later legend credited Gregory's action with the end of the plague and told of the appearance of the archangel Michael putting his drawn sword in its sheath over the mausoleum of the Emperor Hadrian, which was later called the Castle of St. Angelo. Rome was a symbol of the continent. What we now call Europe arose from the ruins of the devastated empire, and it was Christianity that brought life and order out of the chaos. So we'll turn to Gregory's place in history. The church enlisted the Celtic and Benedictine monks to serve as a spiritual force for winning the barbarians to the Christian faith. It turned to the papal office to provide some stable structure for a new way of life and sought a framework of meaning from Augustine's theology. As we saw earlier, his City of God provided a perspective of history. And this, of course, is Augustine of Hippo, not Augustine of Canterbury that we talked about earlier today. In his writing, Gregory stressed that the spiritual leader should never be so absorbed in external cares as to forget the inner life of the soul, nor neglect external things in the care for his inner life. Um, his words were autobiographical, describing his own life. When he died in 604, he was proclaimed God's consul or ambassador. This was an appropriate description of the man who strived to live for God while ruling the church and world like a Roman political leader. Not only after his death, or not long after his death, the churches came to speak of him as Gregory the Great, and his name was included in the list of Latin fathers of the church. His greatness was due to his ability to combine great executive ability with warm sympathy for human need. Gregory was born about 540 into an old and wealthy senatorial family of Rome and was educated for governmental service. In his childhood, control of Rome changed hands numerous times. At age 33, the Emperor Justin appointed him prefect or mayor of Rome, the highest civil position in the city and its surrounding territory. He became responsible for the whole economy of Rome. Gregory was never comfortable with worldly power, however, as he preferred the solitude of the monastery or the life of a monk. Within a few years, he stepped down from public office to move away from worldly life. He spent the greater part of his personal fortune in founding 7 monasteries, giving away the rest as alms for the poor. He lived as a monk and practiced extraordinary asceticism, such as eating only raw fruits and vegetables and praying most of the night. However, his talents could not remain hidden. In 579, Pope Pelagius II made him a deacon of the Roman Church and sent him as ambassador to the imperial court in Constantinople. His political training and executive ability fitted him for this position. Upon his return, he was appointed abbot of his convent, though he still conducted important public business. He was perfectly content to be an abbot and would have continued in the monastic life if the plague had not led to the death of Pope Pelagius II. So let's turn to picking up the pieces of a shattered world. Soon after Gregory's election, the Lombards laid siege to Rome, and the new pope was forced to cut short his preaching. All of Western Europe was in chaos. Serious men, including Gregory, thought that the end of the world was at hand. Though the Church of Rome survived the attacks, it was almost the only trace of organized civilization in the West that did so. Gregory devoted himself to the struggle for order in the midst of chaos. He wrote urgent letters to the managers of his estates in Sicily. He began a vast correspondence with his bishops and set forth the principles of Christian ministry in his writing. The prestige of the papacy in the Middle Ages is in large part due to the practical government maintained by Gregory through these troubled times. During Gregory's time, the Church of Rome controlled extensive lands around Rome. These estates, which amounted to about 1,800 square miles, made the church the richest landowner in Italy. Thus, when the Lombards invaded Italy and destroyed the imperial administration, the church administration headed by Gregory stepped in to feed the population and collect land taxes. Moreover, when Lombard attacks moved closer to Rome, Gregory undertook the defense of central Italy, appointing a military governor and arranging peace with two Lombard leaders. This participation in the political fortunes of Italy became a significant element for the papal office in the centuries that followed. After Gregory, the Pope was no longer only a Christian leader, but an important political figure in European politics. Gregory's leadership increased the authority of the papal office. In a clash with John IV, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Gregory was provoked and irritated by John's use of the honorary title Universal Bishop, which the emperors Leo and Justinian had given to patriarchs. Gregory sought to get this title revoked, feeling it was presumptuous. In opposition to such high-sounding titles, he called himself simply the servant of the servants of God. While he protested titles, he claimed and exercised, as far as he had the opportunity, oversight over the whole Church of Christ, which eventually led his successors to use even more arrogant titles. Ironically, Gregory saw pride as a vicious hound or dog that pursued him relentlessly. However, it is clear that he was susceptible to it. All his vigorous activity and determination seemed to spring from his knowledge of his own pride and his attempt to overcome this evil in himself. We'll turn now to missionary statesmen. With Gregory, monasticism came to the papal throne for the first time. In other words, he was the first monk to become pope. He continued the extreme simplicity of monastic life, surrounded himself with monks, made them bishops and ambassadors, confirmed the rule of Saint Benedict, guaranteed the liberty and property of convents, and by his example and influence, he gave the highest service to the monastic life. One story, which is likely partly fictional, tells of Gregory before becoming pope discovering three young English boys for sale in the Roman marketplace, for sale as slaves. That means in the Roman marketplace, and lamented that they had no knowledge of God. Using word plays, such as describing these young angels as having the appearance of angels, he recognized the need for mission in England. Though he attempted to go himself as a missionary monk, he was unable to do so. But once he became pope, he sent Augustine of Canterbury and 40 monks to take the gospel to England, ultimately providing a link for all Anglo American Christianity with the early church. We'll turn now to defender of orthodoxy. Gregory not only yearned to advance the Christian faith in distant places, but took seriously his calling as a defender of orthodoxy or correct theology. His teachers in the faith were Ambrose, Augustine of Hippo, and Jerome, but he lacked their intellectual abilities. While he contributed no new ideas or theological movement, he formulated the common faith of his day and handed it on to the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. In his doctrine of man or humanity, Gregory stressed that Adam's fall affected his descendants, weakening but not destroying their freedom of will. Thus, once someone has been moved by grace, he or she may cooperate with it and win merit by good works, the joint product of divine grace and human will. In baptism, God grants forgiving grace freely without any merit on a person's part, but for sins committed after baptism, a person must make atonement by penance, a form of punishment inflicted by oneself instead of by God. Penance requires sincere repentance as well as confession of sin and meritorious works, deeds involving sacrifice or suffering, such as giving alms, ascetic practices, and prayers at all hours of the day. The greater one's sins, the more that must be done to make up for them. Whether a person has done enough cannot be known until after death. According to Gregory, sinners have the help of the saints. While they did not originate belief in the intercession of the saints and the custom of appealing to them to use their influence with Christ, his emphasis made them central for Christian spirituality. So the saints, in this case, refers to Christians who have lived in the past and are dead now, and they're seen as closer to God, especially those that were known to be, or especially known for holy living, for their holy lives. So they became objects of reverence for later Christians at this time. Now, another aid to devotion was the holy relics. Gregory encouraged the collection and veneration or adoration of holy remains of the saints and martyrs, such as locks of hair, fingernails, or pieces of clothing, teaching that these items possessed great powers. And he further taught that sins could still be atoned in purgatory, a place of purification and suffering for those who are not altogether righteous, but have not committed serious offenses that would condemn them to an eternity in hell. He further upheld that the Holy Eucharist or the Lord's Supper was the supreme miracle, the key to all the other expressions of divine power. According to Gregory, the Eucharist is a communion with Christ, whose body and blood are present in the bread and wine, which we feed upon to nourish our spiritual lives. The marvelous power of the Eucharist is in its sacrificial character, as it is offered for the sins of those gathered. For these, it has the same effect as penance, and it may also benefit the dead in purgatory by speeding the time of release. In his writing, Gregory tells the story of the death of a monk who had been severely punished after being found guilty of hoarding money. Feeling compassion for the deceased monk, who must be suffering in purgatory, Gregory instructed the prior, that's the term for the leader of a religious order, to celebrate the Eucharist or the Mass every day for 30 days for the monk's release. That's the Catholic worship service that involves the Lord's Supper. So at the end of the 30 days, a fellow monk had a vision of the deceased monk's spirit, reporting that he was now freed from the suffering of purgatory and admitted to communion in heaven. This teaching regarding the Eucharist was widely accepted in the Western Church from Gregory's time and proved an important element of the Christianity of the Middle Ages. All right, now we turn to chapter 19, the search for unity, Charlemagne and Christendom. On April the 25th, 799, Pope Leo III was leading a procession through Rome for God's blessing upon the fields and their harvest after the people had been afflicted with accidents and severe crop damage. The procession led through the middle of the city to St. Peter's Basilica. That's the major church in Rome. During the procession, armed men rushed at the Pope, drove off his attendants, and took him away to a Greek monastery. This was a mutiny led by ranking officials and dignitaries loyal to the previous Pope, Adrian I. They charged Leo with perjury and adultery. However, the Pope's supporters used the cover of darkness to rescue him and bring him back to St. Peter's. However, continued fighting convinced Leo of the need for outside help, and he appealed to the traditional protector of the papacy, who was the king of the Franks, Charles the Great. The next year, Charles crossed the Alps with an army prepared to settle the Pope's problem once and for all. In December, the king presided over a large assembly of bishops, nobles, diplomats, members of the royal household, and rebels. The Pope took an oath, purging himself of the accusations against him. Then, on Christmas Day, Charles came to St. Peter's with a large company for worship. As Leo sang, Charles prayed on his knees. The Pope then approached him with a golden crown, placing it on his head and bowing, as the people cried that Charles was crowned by God as emperor, restoring the Christian Roman Empire, known as the Holy Roman Empire. In the Middle Ages, the modern idea of autonomous sovereign states without religious affiliation and of the church as a voluntary association apart from the rest of organized society did not exist. Drawing on Augustine's vision of the city of God, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, implanted the Christian concept of a universal church into the traditional Roman view of empire, giving to the medieval world Christendom, a unified society mixing religious concerns with earthly affairs. So the um, joining of church and state, we would say, or the making of a Christian civilization. Now, due to the persistence of an idea and the rise of a powerful kingdom, the church became, to a large extent, part of worldly power. So the idea is the Roman Empire that they are trying to revive, and it's the powerful Frankish kingdom that's doing that. But in reality, it's not really continuous with the old Roman Empire. It is something new, Roman in name only. So ideas die slowly. Centuries after its fall to barbarism, the Roman Empire in the West continued its sway over the imaginations of both leaders and followers. As the barbarians had many kingdoms, often at war with each other, many still longed for the unity that had once marked the empire, and they looked for the day when a new Roman Empire would appear. In the blending of Roman and Germanic peoples and cultures, the Franks rose above the others and seemed destined to restore the imperial authority. With the support of the Catholic Church, Clovis had made the kingdom of Franks a dominant power among the German tribes. After his death, however, his dynasty began to decay from inner weakness. The Germanic practice of dividing a kingdom among the king's sons resulted in constant civil war, and royal heirs often engaged in murder, intrigue, and treachery. At the same time, a new center of power arose from the aristocrats who gained more authority. One powerful landowner emerged as the most influential figure in the kingdom, called the mayor of the palace. A new era for the kingdom of the Franks began in 714 when Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather, became mayor of the palace. While he allowed the Merovingian kings to retain their claim to the throne, they were figureheads, while the mayor of the palace had the real power. Victory over the Muslim invaders of Europe earned Charles the name Martel, which means the hammer. In 711, a Muslim army from North Africa had invaded Spain, and by 718, the weak kingdom of the Visigoths had collapsed. When the Muslims began making raid across the Pyrenees Mountains, Charles Martel met them in the Frankish kingdom and inflicted heavy losses on them. They retreated towards Spain and were never again a major threat to Central Europe. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, was a worthy successor to his father. However, he sought to legalize the regal power exercised by the mayors of the palace and turned to the Pope for a ruling that whoever had the actual power should be the legal ruler. In 751, one of his crowns, Pepin, king of the Franks, and the last Merovingian ruler, was quietly removed. 3 years later, the Pope personally anointed Pepin as the Lord's chosen. The Pope's action was likely due to his need for a powerful protector, since the Lombards had conquered the imperial territory at Ravenna, the seat of Byzantine government in Italy, and were demanding tribute from the Pope and threatening Rome. Following Pepin's coronation, the Pope gained his promise of armed intervention in Italy and his pledge to give the papacy the territory of Ravenna once it was conquered. In 756, a Frankish army forced the Lombard king to surrender his conquests, and Pepin kept his promise to give the Ravenna territory to the Pope, making the Pope ruler over a strip of territory known as the Papal States. This alliance between the Franks and the papacy affected the courts of European politics and Christianity for centuries. It accelerated the separation of the Latin Church from the Greek by providing the papacy with a dependable Western ally in place of the Byzantine rulers. It created the Papal States, which played a major role in Italian politics until the late 19th century. It further provided Western kingship with a religious sanction that would eventually contribute to the rivalry between Pope and Emperor. With the rise to power of Pepin's son Charles, known today as Charlemagne, Charles the Great, the final step was taken to restore the Christian empire to the West. When Charles succeeded his father in 768, his mind was set on three goals: military power to crush his enemies, religious power to direct his people's souls, and intellectual power to instruct souls and minds. His success in these areas made the new political order of Europe nominally Christian for 1,000 years, or at least somewhat Christian, if not even if in name only and not in behavior or character. All right, we turn now to architect of an empire. In addition to being a successful warrior king, leading his armies on yearly campaigns, Charlemagne also sought to provide an effective administration for his realm. Four areas were successfully built or successfully added to his kingdom by military might. First was his southern border. Seeking to extend Christendom into Spain, he drove the Muslims back to the Ebro River and established a frontier area known as the Spanish Mark, centered around Barcelona. Second, he conquered Bavarians and Saxons, the last of the independent Germanic tribes. Third, he sought to secure his eastern frontier, which was continually threatened by Asiatic nomadic tribes known as the Slavs and Avars. He decimated the Avars and set up a military province called the Eastmark, which later became Austria, to guard against plundering by Eastern nomads. Finally, he also intervened in Italian politics. When the Lombard king again invaded the papal territories, Charlemagne defeated the Lombards and proclaimed himself their king. He also confirmed the donation of Pepin, which secured his family's alliance with the Church of Rome. This movement into Italy was the precursor to the one in 800 that resulted in his coronation as emperor. The Pope needed protection, as Charlemagne needed divine sanction. While Charlemagne claimed not to know his coronation had been planned, he lived up to it, taking seriously his title of Roman Emperor. His coronation ceremony in St. Peter's demonstrated that the memory of the Roman Empire survived as a vital tradition in Europe and that there was a strong desire to reestablish political unity. However, the coronation also began a long standing struggle between the revived empire and the papacy. In medieval theory, church and state were two aspects of Christendom, the one representing Christian society organized to secure spiritual blessings, the other to safeguard justice and human welfare. Theoretically, church and state were in harmony and worked together, aiming to secure the good of humankind. In fact, however, the Pope and Emperor were contestants, competing over whether the church or state should be in control. The contest was seen in countless areas throughout the Middle Ages. In his lifetime, Charlemagne left no doubt about his sovereignty in his empire, as he proved to be a dominating father figure to Europe. He also created a group of itinerant envoys to supervise local officials. He further fostered a revival of learning and the arts. Few can challenge Charlemagne's claim to greatness as a major constructive figure of world history. From the new center in the north, he extended Christian civilization in Europe and restored a measure of law and order after 3 centuries of disorder. And the imperial idea he revised persisted as a political force in Europe until 1806. We turn now to the decline into feudalism. Unfortunately, the territories of Charlemagne's empire were too vast and its nobility too powerful to be held together after Charlemagne's death. Under his weak successors, the empire disintegrated amid the confusion of civil wars and new invasions. When Vikings from the Northland raided, people surrounded their lands and freedoms, or people surrendered their lands and freedoms to the counts, dukes, and other local lords in return for protection. This situation is known as feudalism, a type of government in which political power was exercised locally by private individuals rather than by agents of a centralized state. Central to feudalism was the personal bond between lord and vassal. The vassal promised loyalty to his lord, and the vassal was granted property, known as the fief. The feudal contract entered into by lord and vassal was considered sacred and binding on both parties. It was the fundamental bond of every medieval society, and breaking it was considered a felony. The lord was obliged to give his vassal protection and justice, while the vassal's primary duty was military service. The conditions caused by new raiders, Vikings from the north and Magyars from Asia, forced church officials to enter into a feudal relationship with the barons in France and the kings in Germany, the only ones powerful enough to offer them protection. Loyalty to these lords created conflicts for those bishops who looked to the Pope as God's appointed leader of the church. On the positive side, however, the church sought to influence for the better the behavior of the feudal barons. In addition to attempting to add Christian virtues to the code of knightly conduct called chivalry, the church tried to impose limitations on feudal warfare. Only after the German king Otto the Great revived the Roman Empire in the West in 962 was some sense of unity restored. With the renewal of the empire, however, came the old rivalry between church and state. At first, the papacy looked to the German king for protection against the unruly Italian nobles, yet the arrangement had disadvantages for the 11th, or for the church, for the German kings interfered in church affairs, even in the election of popes. During the 11th century, the controversy between church and state centered on the problem of lay investiture. That means church officials being appointed by lay people rather than by church leaders. Theoretically, on taking office, a bishop or abbot was subject to two investitures. His spiritual authority was bestowed by a church official, and his feudal or civil authority by the king or noble. In fact, however, feudal lords and kings came to control both the appointment and installation of church officials. The practice was most prominent in Germany, where control of the church was the foundation of the king's power. Let's turn to setting in order the house of God. The church was unprepared to challenge kings and emperors. It needed to set its own house in spiritual order, which began with a revival within the Reformed Benedictine Order of Cluny, founded in 910. A powerful force from the original monastery in Burgundy called for the reform of the feudalized church. The Cluniac reform began as a movement for monastic reform. The ultimate goal of the reformers was to free the entire church from secular control and subject it to papal authority. In 1059, the papacy was removed from secular interference by the creation of the College of Cardinals, which afterward elected the popes. The reform of the papacy was led by an archdeacon named Hildebrand. He was elected pope in 1073 as Gregory VII, and he claimed unprecedented power for the pope, holding as his ideal the creation of a Christian commonwealth under papal control. Instead of conceding equality between the church and state, he also insisted that the spiritual power was supreme over the temporal, or that the church had authority over the state. In 1075, he formally prohibited lay investiture and threatened to excommunicate or ban from the church anyone who practiced it. Since most of Europe's rulers engaged in this practice, this led to conflict. The climax of the struggle occurred in Gregory's clash with the Emperor Henry IV. The Pope accused Henry of simony, which means the purchase of or sale of church office, and lay investiture and appointing his own choice to be the Archbishop of Milan. Gregory summoned Henry to Rome to explain his conduct. Henry responded by convening a synod of German bishops that declared Gregory was a usurper and unfit to be pope, renouncing obedience to him. In retaliation, Gregory excommunicated and deposed Henry, absolving his subjects from their oaths of allegiance. Driven to make peace with the Pope by a revolt among the German nobles, Henry appeared before Gregory in January 1077 at Canossa, a castle in the mountains of Italy. Dressed as a penitent, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days and begged forgiveness until Gregory restored him into the church. The dramatic humiliation of the emperor did not resolve the conflict, given that public penance was common in those days, even for kings. Yet the Pope had made progress toward freeing the church from interference by lay people and toward increasing the power and prestige of the papacy. At the Concordat of Worms in 1122, a compromise to the lay investiture conflict was reached, in which the church maintained the right to elect people to church offices, but only in the presence of the emperor or his representative. Later popes, like Gregory, insisted that Christian society was organized under the Pope, its visible head, and he was guarded against all possibility of error by the presence of Peter perpetually and his successors, the bishops of Rome. While many of Gregory's claims now appear intolerable, we must agree that Gregory and his successors stood for two principles that Christians see as undeniable. Spiritual loyalty has primacy over secular loyalty, and the families of men and women can find true unity only in Christ and in obedience to the law of Christ, or the law of God. During the Middle Ages, Europe became conscious of itself as a unity, and the church attained a level of power and influence over people's lives, which, for the most part, it used helpfully, that it has never had since that time. And now we turn to chapter 20, lifted in a mystic manner, the papacy and the crusader. In Paris stands the Gothic cathedral of Notre Dame, dedicated to the glory of God and the honor of Our Lady, meaning the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. This well-known sanctuary reflects a fascinating image of the life and spirits of the Christian Middle Ages. Notre Dame was constructed between 1162 and 1235, some of the most significant years of Western Christianity. While workers were constructing its elaborate details, students exchanged reports of crusader victories in the Holy Land or debated theological virtues. Some of these students would soon become bishops, and one would carry the papal office to the peak of worldly power as Pope Innocent III. Notre Dame was only one example of the vigorous church building occurring in Europe. Between 1170 and 1270, more than 500 great churches were built in Gothic style in France alone. The Gothic style of architecture first appeared in the restoration of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis near Paris. The abbot Juger conceived the project and guided the work of rebuilding. Afterwards, he described the work of reconstruction as being so grand that it essentially stood between heaven and earth, and he claimed to feel himself lifted in a mystic manner from the lower realm to the upper realm. The Middle Ages were not all dark, despite our common designation of this era as the Dark Ages. No age has aspired for greatness quite like the High Middle Ages. We'll turn now to Thy Kingdom Come. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the papacy led an admirable attempt to develop a perfect society on earth. The church achieved an incomparable power and majesty. However, like the Gothic cathedrals, over time it deteriorated. With the church buildings, early Gothic builders tried to reach as high as possible with the materials available. For example, the equivalent of a 30-story skyscraper seen in the Cathedral of Chartres or 40 stories of the Strasbourg Cathedral. Yet many efforts resulted in repeated failures in church construction. By reaching the greatest height possible, the architect tried to create the illusion of soaring or flying. The use of flying buttresses or supports eliminated the massive walls of earlier churches and made possible slender pillars carved in the form of still more slender shafts reaching upward toward heaven. This can be seen as an image that describes Western Christianity in the 12th and 13th centuries. Papacy ascended high above European society, resting upon the fading glory of the empire. The emergence of unified national states greatly reduced the power of the empire. Emperors became merely the sovereigns of the cluster of kingdoms and republics that constituted the Germany of the Middle Ages. In contrast, the papacy built on the reforms of Pope Gregory VII and emerged as the most powerful office in Europe. The Pope's government was a truly universal monarchy as it became completely centralized. In the hands of a strong leader, the papacy could overshadow all secular monarchs. Pope Innocent III proved such a strong leader, a new type of administrator pope. Innocent and other great popes of the era were experts in church government. Innocent declared that Peter, and by extension the papal office, was the vicar or minister of Christ and a mediator between God and humanity. He told the princes of Europe that the papacy was like the sun, while kings were like the moon. Kings derived their powers from the Pope the way the moon receives its light from the sun. The Pope maintained his authority through spiritual penalties, and almost everyone believed in the Pope's management of the grace that would lead to heaven, and that hell would be the result of losing this grace. Thus, the Pope could use the threat of excommunication, again, that means expulsion from the church, as a weapon to bring both peasants and princes under his authority. By the pronouncement of this curse and expulsion from the church, it was believed that people would be deprived of the grace essential for salvation. And while under excommunication, persons could not act as judge, juror, witness, or attorney. They also could not participate in contracts. The Pope also could make use of the interdict, which applied to whole nations, suspending all public worship and withdrawing most of the sacraments from the lands of disobedient rulers. Pope Innocent III successfully applied or threatened the interdict 85 times against uncooperative princes. With such methods, the Pope claimed both earthly as well as spiritual supremacy. Many states even acknowledged him as their feudal lord. For example, after facing the interdict of England, King John became the Pope's vassal, received England back as a fief, and paid an annual tribute to the Pope. In France, Innocent forced King Philip Augustus to comply with the church's moral code by taking back as his queen the woman he had divorced. And within the Holy Roman Empire, or Germany, Innocent intervened in a civil war between rival candidates for the throne and secured the election of the young Hohenstaufen heir Frederick II, who promised to respect papal rights and to go on a crusade. With these devices used as spiritual weapons, Innocent and his successors in the papal office during the 13th century led Christianity to its peak of political and cultural influence. The soaring dreams and delusions of the papacy in this period can be seen especially in the Crusades and in scholasticism. In one, the Pope claimed power over the holy cause in history. In the other, he maintained authority over the souls of men and women, even in eternity. We'll turn now to taking up the cross for Christ. The Crusades reflected the new dynamics of Western Christianity. Islam had come to birth through the visions and revelations claimed by the Prophet Muhammad, who was born in 570. At the age of 40, he began to retire into a cave for extended periods of contemplation and meditation. After one of these occasions, he told his wife that he had been visited by an angel who ordered him to recite. From that command came the Quran, which literally means to recite. While he was initially perplexed, his wife told him this could be the call of God upon him. A handful of family members followed him, while many resisted his claims to be God's spokesman. After various battles and arguments, Muhammad was able to gain a vast following in Arabia. In the first 100 years, numerous capitals such as Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo fell to Islam. After Muhammad's death in 632, his succession became a divisive issue as a struggle for the movement or the leadership of the movement took place. One group, the Sunnis, insisted that the first caliph or leader of Islam to succeed Muhammad be elected. The other group, the Shiites, argued that the successor must come from Muhammad's family, and thus should be Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law. In the age of the Grand Cathedrals, crusaders from Western Europe attempted to expel the Muslims from the Holy Land, which is Palestine. Historians have attributed numerous motives to the Crusaders: religious fervor, love of adventure, and dreams of personal profit. Christians also sought to counter Islam's strong military conquest and keep their geographic strongholds from being overrun. By the 8th century, one half of all Christians lived under Islamic rule. For centuries, peaceful pilgrims had been traveling from Europe who worship at the birthplace of Christ. The rise and spread of Islam in the Near East during the 7th century did not interrupt this traffic. By the 10th century, bishops organized mass pilgrimages or religious journeys to the Holy Land. During the 11th century, however, Christian pilgrims began to encounter persecution, which became especially severe when the Seljuk Turks, who were fanatical converts to Islam, swept into the Holy Land. Forces from the Eastern Empire tried desperately to bar the invaders, but at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Turks captured the Eastern Empire and scattered his army. Within a few years, Asia Minor, the chief source of Byzantine revenues and troops, was lost, and the emperor was writing to Western princes and to the Pope, seeking mercenaries to aid in the rescue of lost territories. In addition, tales of alleged Turkish mistreatment of Christian pilgrims throughout the people, or spread throughout Europe, which incited those in the West against the Muslims. In 1095, after the Eastern Emperor sent out an urgent appeal for help, Pope Urban II proclaimed the First Crusade and to regain the Holy Land. Preaching at the Council of Clermont in southeastern France, the Pope urged Christians to take up the cross and strive for a cause that promised both spiritual reward and material gain. As Urban ended his impassioned appeal, a cry of "God wills it" came from the multitudes, becoming the battle cry against the Muslim army or Muslim enemy. For 7 centuries, Christians have tried to forget the Crusades, but Jews and Muslims will not allow them to do so. The Crusaders were human beings, so their motives were mixed and often in conflict. The word crusade refers to taking up the cross, after the example of Christ. So, and thus applying Jesus' call to sacrifice to the cause of war. So the Crusaders were fully aware of the spiritual rewards. Urban promised them, including full forgiveness of their past sins. Most of them also had respect for the land that Jesus had walked on. Right? Urban and those who followed him saw the Crusaders or the Crusades as a new type of war, the Holy War. Though Augustine had laid down principles for a just war, these were all set aside in the excitement of the cause. The purpose of the Crusades changed from liberating fellow Christians to conquest of infidels or non Christians in the Holy Land. And the supposedly high calling was believed to excuse acts of brutality, such as disregard for non combatants and prisoners. The beginning of the Crusades led to the horrible attacks against the Jews, and even fellow Christians were not spared from rape and plunder. Christians also committed terrible atrocities on their Muslim foes, sawing open dead bodies and sometimes engaging in acts of cannibalism. Let's look at key events of the Crusades. From the 11th century to the end of the 13th century, Christian Europe, led by the popes, launched 7 major crusades, as well as various small expeditions. The First Crusade was composed of feudal nobles from France, parts of Germany, and southern Italy, where the Norman invaders had settled. The armies proceeded overland to Constantinople and were hastily directed by the emperor out of Constantinople to fight the Turks. The First Crusade was the most successful of the 7. With no more than 5,000 knights and infantry, it overcame the resistance of the Turks, who were no longer united. It captured the city of Jerusalem and a long strip of territory along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, and created the feudal kingdom of Jerusalem, which survived until 1291, when its last remnant fell to the Muslims. When the kingdom of Jerusalem faced its first crisis and was near the brink of destruction in 1147, the mystic Bernard of Clairvaux called for the Second Crusade. This crusade achieved nothing and faded away after 2 years. The original excitement had cooled, and signs of corruption of the holy cause were apparent as the popes became more interested in financial gain. In the Middle Ages, it was believed sins had to be confessed in order to be forgiven. Upon hearing a confession, the priest not only pronounced the penitent's guilt forgiven, but also required a penalty as a mark of repentance. Purgatory was claimed to provide an opportunity for penitence after death if the person died before performing baptism. Such penance was called temporal punishment. For years, the church had claimed the power to remit only to remit part of this temporal punishment, but no complete remission had been granted until Urban II. Urban II offered total remission or indulgence for crusaders who headed for England or headed for Jerusalem. It was only a slight step farther to confer similar benefits upon those who were unable to go on a crusade but who contributed to the cause. By 1187, Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, brought vigorous leadership to the Muslims. When Jerusalem was retaken by the Muslims, Christians responded to the call for the Third Crusade in 1189. Its leaders were three of the most important or most famous medieval kings: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Richard the Lionhearted of England, and Philip Augustus of France. To keep the Muslims united, Saladin proclaimed a jihad or holy war against the Christians. Yet he, yet he also was a patient statesman and made a proposal for a settlement. Richard and Saladin finally agreed to a 3-year truce and free access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims. The Fourth Crusade revealed the harsh realities of papal ambitions in the East and the degradation of the crusading zeal. Upon becoming Pope in 1198, Innocent III devoted himself to the effort of changing or reviving the crusading spirit. But the few knights who responded were unable to meet the large shipping charges demanded by the Venetians, who persuaded them to capture the Christian town of Zara that had been an ongoing nuisance to Venetian ships to meet these costs. In 1202, the Crusaders sacked Zara. Innocent excommunicated all who participated. The Venetians then pressured the Crusaders to attack Constantinople. The Crusaders ravaged the city and set up the Latin Empire of Constantinople in 1204. Forgetting about the deliverance of the Holy Land, Innocent wrote a condemnation of the Crusades, yet he took advantage of the situation to appoint an Archbishop of Constantinople to serve Roman interests. The Latin Empire in Constantinople lasted. The Latin Empire in Constantinople lasted until 1261, but the ancient city never fully recovered. The conquest increased the division between the Greek and Latin churches, and hastened the fall of the city in 1453 to the Turks. Other crusaders marched and wandered east during these years, but were unable to stop or postpone the return of the Holy Land to Muslim control. The era of the Crusades ended in 1291 when Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land, fell to the Muslims. Let's look at results of the Holy Cause. The long range results of 2 centuries of crusading zeal are not impressive. The Crusades failed to win the Holy Land, check the advance of Islam, or heal the division between the Eastern and Western churches. For a time, 4 kingdoms led by Jerusalem were established along the eastern Mediterranean coast of the Holy Land. In these, the Crusaders created 3 semi-monastic military orders: the Templars, Knights of the Temple, with headquarters on the site of the old Jerusalem Temple; the Hospitallers, or Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, founded to care for the sick and wounded; and the Teutonic Knights, an exclusively German order. These orders had as their aims the protection of all pilgrims and perpetual war against the Muslims. Perhaps the most significant result was the added splendor the Crusades brought to the papacy. Not only did a pope launch the First Crusade, but popes throughout the period were the primary inspiration for fresh expeditions. They, rather than the emperors, strove to unite Christendom against Islam. But like the Gothic architects who built their cathedrals higher until the towers collapsed, the popes tried the impossible. While Christian Europe took Syria and Jerusalem in a fit of enthusiasm, it had no power to retain them. From the mistakes of the Pope, we should remember 2 basic truths. First, Christianity's highest satisfaction is not guaranteed by the possession of special places. Second, the sword is never God's way to extend the church. These faults eventually led to a religious collapse of the structure of Christian Europe. Okay, this ends our lecture for today. For the primary text, I have given you Gregory's book 11, letter 65, about the scheme of organization for the English church. Here's the website that you can, or the link that you can use to access this text online if you want to see it directly online. And here is the letter. It's Gregory writing to Augustine of Canterbury about how to organize the church in England. Okay. For the assignment for this week, please write 1 to 2 paragraphs or 1 page maximum. What is the main idea you took from this week's lecture? And if you want to do the extra credits, again, write 1 to 2 more paragraphs or 1 page more maximum. Briefly describe in your own words what you learned about Gregory's plan for the organization of the English church from his book 11, letter 65, that is here in the lecture notes for today. All right, now before we conclude, I have a study guide I want to go over for the midterm next week. Next week, there will be no lecture. The midterm exam will be all you have to do, and you will get credit for attendance if you complete the midterm exam. And then the midterm will be graded and will make up part of your your final course grade. All right, so let's open the study guide here. Study guide for BMN 510 Church History Midterm Exam. Okay, so you do not need to submit the answers to the study guide to me, and you will not earn credit for doing so. So please don't give me the answers. This does not do anything for you to send me the answers. Again, this is not the test. This is just the study guide. The study guide is meant to help you prepare for next week's exam. The test will include mostly multiple choice, true and false, and a small number of matching questions. There will also be a few short essay questions and some questions for extra credit. The study guide gives you 40 questions from which the main test questions will be drawn. If you can answer these questions, you should be able to answer the main test questions. Extra credit questions may be drawn from additional class notes not included in the study guide. Okay, so here are the following questions. There will be multiple choice, true or false, or matching. And I've tried to arrange these by where you find the answers or from which lecture. So from lecture 1 comes the first several questions. So the term, number 1, the term blank means good news and describes the Christian message about Jesus. Number 2, blank are non-Jewish people. Number 3, the blank were radical Jewish revolutionaries who sought to use armed resistance against the Romans, both during the time of Jesus and afterwards, leading up to the fall of Jerusalem. 4, the blank was the Jewish converts to Christianity who spread the Christian message to the Gentiles. 5, the most famous missionary in the early period of the church after the apostles was blank. Number 6, the blank were two groups that believed that Jesus was born as a mere man and received power at his baptism. Number 7, blank describes the view that Jesus was a spirit who only seemed to be human and thus did not truly die on the cross. Number 8, blank was a movement that emphasized enlightenment by secret knowledge, which typically taught that the soul is good and that the body and physical world are evil. The supreme God did not create the world, and Jesus came to give knowledge to a secret group. 9, blank was a Gnostic heretic who rejected the Old Testament in his list of sacred books. Number 10, blank claimed to have ongoing prophetic words from the Holy Spirit and demanded purer conduct than typically found in the church. Okay, now the next questions are taken from lecture 2. Number 1, the term blank or yardstick describes the collection of books the early church saw as authoritative and included in the Bible. Number 2, the term blank describes the Christian belief in one God who exists in 3 persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Number 3, the Emperor blank sought to require all citizens to make sacrifices to the pagan Roman gods with severe persecution of those who refused. Number 4, Christians who denied the faith under persecution were known as blank. Number 5, the Roman Emperor blank oversaw the greatest persecution of Christians. Number 6, blank was the first Christian emperor of the Roman Empire. Number 7, blank was a false teaching that claimed that Jesus was a created being and lesser than God. Number 8, the blank settled the debate over Arianism. Number 9, blank spread the false teaching that Jesus had a normal human body, but divine wisdom replaced a human mind in him. So we had essentially human body, but God's mind, not a human mind. Number 10, the teaching associated with blank failed to see the divine and human natures of Christ as united and essentially divided Christ into two persons. Number 11, blank is often regarded as the first monk. Number 12, the monastic reformer, blank, developed a popular set of regulations for communal life in monasteries, making them havens of peace and civilization. Okay, the next questions come from lecture 3. Blank was an African theologian who explained the Trinity. Number 2, his book, the same theologian's book, blank, gives a perspective of history. Number 3, name the 5 important centers of activity of early Christians. Number 4, a monk named blank spread the Christian scriptures in China in 635. Number 5, blank defended the view that Jesus had only one nature, and essentially his divinity absorbed his humanity. Number 6, blank was the first nation to adopt Christianity as the state religion. Number 7, blank taught at a school in Alexandria where they used popular philosophy to teach people about Christianity. So this is 2 names in this question here, 2 different people you should look for. Number 8, the Council of blank condemned the Monophysite view and claimed that Jesus had 2 natures united in one person. Number 9, the emperor's wife, blank, advocated on behalf of Christian groups that did not accept the Chalcedonian view. Number 10, the dominant city for Eastern Orthodox Christianity was blank. Okay, finally, here are a few questions from lecture 4. Blank was taken as a slave from England and later served as a missionary in Ireland. Number 2, blank was a pope who brought order to Europe following attacks on Rome and ultimately became an important political leader. Number 3, during the Middle Ages, blank unified Europe into a Christian empire and was crowned as Holy Roman Emperor. Number 4, during the Crusades, Christian Europeans sought to free the Holy Land from the blank. Number 5, blank was the monk sent to England by Pope Gregory to become the first English archbishop. Number 6, the government during medieval Europe, in which political power, this is the form of government in which political power was exercised locally by lords to whom vassals promised loyalty in exchange for grants of property. Number 7, the Holy Roman Emperor, blank, stood barefoot in the snow for days to humble himself before the Pope after being excommunicated. And number 8, Pope blank proclaimed the First Crusade. And finally, the essay questions will come from your extra credits, homework questions. So that should give you most of the questions you'll need for the midterm exam next week. Wish you all the best. You'll just receive the midterm exam. For this week, again, do the normal attendance assignment and submit that to me. Within the next week, I'll get back to you. I'll get caught up on all the grading probably the next few days and get back to you. But then next week, you'll just get the midterm exam. And that's all you'll need to do for attendance as well as for your midterm grade. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Hope you all have a great week.